Welcome to Neurosalience, the OHBM podcast.
Welcome to the OHBM Neurosalience podcast. I'm Peter Bannattini, and here I interview scientists from around the world to discuss all things related to brain imaging and modeling. Today, my guest is Dr. Mario Senden, an assistant professor in the Department of Cognitive Neuroscience at Maastricht University in the Netherlands. He spent his entire academic career at the University of Maastricht, receiving his bachelor's in psychology in 2009 and PhD in cognitive computational neuroscience in 2016. Dr. Senden is a cognitive computational neuroscientist pioneering biophysics-aware deep learning to define the fundamental principles of neural information processing. He researches the interaction between neural dynamics and network topology across mesoscale laminar microcircuits and the macroscale connectome. His research program is built on a network of key collaborations with leading labs in the Netherlands, Spain, Germany, and France, translating scientific excellence into global impact and fostering growth. Mario is known for computational and theoretical work on how large-scale brain networks support communication, integration, and perception, often using connectomics and whole brain modeling. His early work showed using model-based effective connectivity with fMRI that highly connected rich club hubs dynamically gate information flow across the cortex during tasks. A central direction in his current work is the development of functional whole brain models. Those are models that combine large-scale anatomic structure with local dynamics and goal-driven, task-performing computation. Functional whole brain modeling allows the evaluation of not only whether a dynamical regime is biologically plausible, but whether it actually supports perceptual or cognitive function. What caught my attention was his most recent paper that he recently submitted to Aperture Neuro, titled The Evolving Landscape of Neuroscience. This meta-scientific mapping project made me then reflect even further on how the field organizes its theories and how we can bridge across scales and domains. This paper is a comprehensive, data-driven analysis of neuroscience's structural organization, trends, and future directions by the analysis of about 500,000 articles published between 1999 and 2023. He used text embeddings, semantic clustering, and large language models to map the field with some interesting insights, which we'll talk about in the podcast. I really love this conversation, as I feel he's an early adopter and of a growing trend to try to bring it all together. All research across scales and domains to model and, more importantly, to understand the brain. I hope you enjoy it. Okay, hello. I'm Peter Bannattini, and this is another episode of the OHBM Neurosalience podcast. You'll have to forgive me. I've had a little bit of a cold and my voice is still recovering. But today I'm very excited and happy to have on Dr. Mario Senden. He's an assistant professor at Maastricht University. The way that Dr. Senden kind of realized what he was doing, I was directed by Fruc Koyman, person who was one of the producers of this podcast a while ago, on his paper. And I've been thinking about the themes that we'll talk about for quite some time. And there's some themes that are kind of riffed on in the special issue of Aperture, on looking at the state of the brain from 2024. But what Mario is doing is he's a computational neuroscientist and working on trying to, what we're all doing is trying to understand the brain, but he's sort of taking a step back and saying, okay, how do we bring it all together? How do we bring all the disciplines, all the understanding that we have from various siloed labs together in a way that kind of ratchets the knowledge forward? So Mario, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you. It's a pleasure to have you. And I'm looking forward to a good conversation. So what I always like to start out with, just to introduce you, to everyone, is talking a little bit about your history. I think a lot of people listening to this podcast are sort of either postdocs or junior faculty, and they like to understand like where everyone else came from and what their story is. So maybe first question is, so you started in psychology,
I
and
started
then
in
you
psychology. Yeah.
got your bachelor's in cognitive neuroscience, and then you went into cognitive computational neuroscience. So first of all, what got you interested in psychology?
To be honest, I don't quite remember exactly what got me interested specifically into psychology. I think I always liked puzzling in a way. Originally, I thought of psychology as being a clinician, being a therapist. And I found it really exciting. On the one hand, of course, you can help people, but it's also this whole aspect of you are in the situation with the person and you have to solve a puzzle at the same time, right? What is the diagnosis of this person? How can you help this person? This is all a lot of puzzling. And I was always fascinated by this aspect of it. And that got me into studying this. But I realized early on, as I was studying this, that especially where I was studying in Maastricht, that they had a big research focus. So that opened a completely new world for me because I hadn't thought about science before as a career. But that opened this up, and they also had a bit this biological perspective. And that got me more and more interested in the brain. So that's how it went from first psychology, and then it went a bit more into the brain. And then we had one course that introduced us to artificial neural networks, and that was just absolutely fascinating to me.
That was when you were in your master's degree?
That was in the bachelor's. We had one course on that, and that made me decide to go for cognitive and then more for computational neuroscience. I was absolutely fascinated by neural networks. These were more the ones that we now have in deep learning, right? These abstract. But then I thought, oh, wow, and they're spiking neurons and they're coupled together. It's so cool. And then I pushed more and more in that direction. That's how this whole arc happened, from psychology, cognitive neuroscience, computational neuroscience, and then bringing it all together at this cognitive computational aspect, that the cognition had to come back.
That's interesting. So you're right, because pure psychology is a very different track than neural networks. And so, right, when you were undergraduate, you were like around 2000. Well, you graduated in 2009. So neural networks were just kind of taking off again. I mean, there was a lull, because I remember when I was an undergraduate, it was in the late 80s, and it was neural networks, but nothing worked. It was like, oh my gosh, we don't know what we're doing here yet, and it's not working. And so, but it's kind of cool, but it was just starting to get traction.
Yeah, it's really amazing. I'm actually very amazed by the person who made this course, because I remember as a student, I was fascinated by it, but many of my fellow students said, what is the point of this? Not many people were excited by this. So after I graduated, I started teaching this course. And of course, after 2015, nobody asked anymore what's the point. Then it had really taken off. I have to say, this person who gave the course was also ahead of his time, that he knew this will be a thing again.
Oh, that's very cool. And that was and so that was at Maastricht as well. Do you know who the professor was? Is it somebody that
Fontaine is his name.
What's his name?
Fontaine.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I don't recognize the name, but still, I mean, it's amazing how just one course and like one person can change the trajectory of your life at that time. So it's important always.
Yeah. It was really one course that, made a big turn after that.
That's cool. And then because, right, the typical psychology track is sort of like you become a clinical psychologist. And,
exactly. Yeah.
And you treat patients, and it's a very, it's a difficult track, but at the same time, it's very focused on that. And they're less interested in actually, it's more like, you figure out best therapy techniques or things like that.
Exactly.
All right. Well then, okay. So then you got your master's and then your PhD at Maastricht as well. So were you working with Rainer Goebel, or what? I guess everyone kind of works with Rainer.
Yeah, but he was my promoter. So yeah.
Okay.
We're working quite closely.
All right. Well, that's great. So as far as just to define cognitive computational neuroscience. So what people hear this, and there's actually a meeting that's been going on since for 10 years on this. And so what exactly is cognitive computational neuroscience, and how does it differ from just simply computational neuroscience?
Yeah, so the way I see it is that computational neuroscience has actually two big phases or two big directions. So on the one hand, it is studying the brain like maybe a climate scientist would, or a computational chemist would study their particular phenomena of interest. So it is coupled differential equations that explain, let's say in the case of the brain again, activity patterns, spiking statistics, but it can be devoid of function, right? You look at it in the way that you might also look at, I don't know, attraction of two bodies to each other with gravity, right?
Yeah.
This happens because of laws, but there's no computation, no purpose behind this.
Yes.
And then there's this other branch that is very much interested in this information processing that the brain does. And I would say the one has been focused a lot on biology and the other has been focused more on cognition. And cognitive computational neuroscience tries to bring them closer together. So to still have the cognition, but to have it grounded more in biology. I think that's a big effort and a big driving force in the last 10, 15 years behind this movement of cognitive computational neuroscience. But I would see it all as branches within computational neuroscience, the very mechanistic biophysical branch, the more cognitive branch, and then the movement to bring it together.
Okay. That's a good explanation, because that was actually my next question is like, ultimately, they all should converge. Once our understanding is fully complete, we can, make the connections all the way up. And actually, right, there's many different, I read a book a couple of years ago, I even had her on the podcast, Grace Lindsay, has this book called Models of the Mind. And, or I think that's the name of it. It goes across all the modeling. And, some are very low level, it starts out, action potentials, and then others are more completely abstracted. And that's sometimes I think of computational neuroscience is also as basically they look at, objects like semantic objects or things like that. And they don't really, it's not really grounded in biology. But then also there's computational, as you're saying, that is is very grounded, but doesn't really care about these emergent cognition as much.
Yeah, I agree. The term emergent is exactly right. So to the extent that they care about function, it just should pop up out of, if you have the building blocks and you have the wiring diagrams, you just build it together and then the function emerges.
Yes.
And I think the other side doesn't quite believe this always happens.
Yeah, it's always risky. That was sort of popular a couple of years, about 5 to 10 years ago, this idea that, consciousness is emergence, all these things are emergent properties. And somehow it just seemed like a cop-out to say that, because it's like, well, you're hoping that something magical happens that emerges, and maybe it does. Maybe there is such they're understood to be emergent properties of networks and whatever. But kind of trying to rely on, well, if you make it complicated enough and if you make it interactive enough, then something will emerge. Is kind of there was a whole position paper on this that it was like, fundamentally unscientific or something, but I wouldn't go that far myself, but I think that one should not rely on.
No, exactly. I also believe that emergence is certainly something that happens in nature and in the brain. But in modeling, I think you also need this cognitive high-level perspective to know what are the relevant ingredients to get to your emergence. Otherwise, you include things that might not be relevant.
Exactly. Okay, that's a good setup for now what we're going to be talking about. So maybe just one more question before we really dig into your kind of history of how you started, what research you were doing. So do you see, just off the top of your head, maybe like what the limits of some of the models, cognitive computational neuroscience models are? Like, are they unconnected? Are they more descriptive and less quantitative? Is it still untethered from biology to some degree, or is it still a black box? I mean, how much is a black box? How much is, what would you say would be defined like, limits of the current state of the field?
Yeah. I think they are.
Sorry, that's a big.
It's a big question and a good question. And I think it comes again that we have the different perspectives that even within the cognitive computational neuroscience, you have the people who started out from the one side and those who started out from the other side. And they bring their inherent limitations with them. And to some extent, it is difficult if you come from the one side to get to the other, right? It's a different language you suddenly have to speak.
Yeah.
That makes it difficult. And then other difficulty is also just in our methodology. So if you come from the biological side, you invest a lot of computational resources in getting the biological details simulated. And then you have not so much left to have also complex cognitive functions in there.
Yes.
And from the other side, it's exactly the same. You start with something that is very powerful, like deep learning, to get you function. But the moment you start to switch things to make them more biological, this whole training these things and doing these things become harder and harder and harder. So it is also just from this methodological side, it's very hard to completely bridge the things.
Yeah, well, that's a beautiful description, because I think that sort of illustrates the limits of, we're trying to, and it seems like it's just like this iterative process of trying to connect this with theory, and the theory is always a little bit not quite can get enough traction with the biology, and then you try to iterate, and then of course there's also something theoretical neuroscience where you constantly try to use either biology to inform AI algorithms or AI algorithms to help understand what's going on in the brain. And there's things like back propagation or things like that are not really biologically based. And so the brain, has algorithms that we're still trying to figure out what they are in that regard. And there's this tension in that, there's this gap that people are aware of.
Yeah, absolutely. So of course, there are people also trying to find the biological version of backpropagation. So can we actually map this onto biological processes? And that's also a very big and important part of the work. But yeah, maybe another bridge factor that's also difficult is we also don't always know which detail of the biology is relevant.
Yes.
There might be something we put in and it has actually no effect, and it was completely for nothing that we added it, other than costing us more computational power, but something else is, and we don't know yet.
Yes. That's actually really a good point, because that's constantly what I'm asking. Like, for instance, long time ago when I interviewed Danny Bassett, and she's very, obviously she's the best in the world in what she does in terms of modeling networks. And then I was thinking, okay, you're looking at the brain at a certain spatial temporal scale. And, do you really think that you can actually get at, fundamental principles of brain function at that scale? I mean, so is there something else that matters at a lower scale that would help inform this in some sense?
Yeah, to me, that is, I think for myself, this is currently the biggest question I have. Whether in the brain we can actually meaningfully talk about separation of scales. So I think we all think, and I think it's very important that we understand the scales and try to bridge the scales. But I would also like to understand which scales need bridging and which don't. Is it possible that maybe there is something like a macroscopic scale that operates on its own? Right? I mean, of course, in some sense, the microscopic scale gives rise to it. But that doesn't mean that maybe we can entirely understand it at the macroscopic scale without ever looking down.
Yes.
In the sense that maybe there are other microscopic processes that would give rise to the exact same thing at the macroscopic level. So it is entirely closed in some sense, and it makes sense to only look at this macroscopic scale.
Yes.
Or not, right? and we don't know this yet. But for me, that's a big question, because then to the extent that we build theory, if we know this is separate, we need separate theories for the different scales. If it's not separate, we need theories that bridge the scales, and we need to also methodology that bridges the scales. So this is for me a very big fundamental question that I find very exciting.
Yeah, no, it's very exciting. Right. I mean, even among my people in NIMH, all the neuroscientists who study all the different scales, I remember once asking, so what's the most important scale? And they looked at me like I was crazy, because they're like, well, they're all important. And I'm like, well, okay, that's not, I guess the question is, right, what's the important scale maybe to derive principles of how the brain is organized and functions? I mean, there might be a level that, obviously, it's based on, cells that are just doing their thing. And do we need to actually to create, an AI that simulates brain function? Do we need cells in that sense that function in this way, or could it be solved in some other way? Maybe those questions are trying to derive principles that will then help you think or more intelligently about what scale is most important or not. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I sometimes think maybe it's just dependent on the question, that for
Yeah.
some questions you need this scale. So I can think of, if you have diseases like Alzheimer's, then there is something very concrete biologically going on. And even if in principle you might say the psychological scale or the cognitive scale could be separated from this biological scale, the moment something specific goes wrong on this biological scale, the cognitive scale follows. So in that sense, it is very important to understand this lower scale and
Yes.
get the ideas right. But maybe for healthy cognition, I started with psychology. So maybe the psychological level where you just study that has its own intrinsic value, and you can find principles that operate on that level where you don't
Yes.
need to look down. So I think it might depend on what exactly you're interested in as
Yeah,
well.
exactly. And we haven't even brought up like the idea of metabolism and
Oh, yeah.
blood flow and that thing that also influences this. So that naturally leads into your early work. Okay, that's a perfect lead in, because as far as understanding the brain, I think there's been probably much of the bulk of the work that's been really good has been, well, visual processing, but also you've been doing rich clubs. And so the idea of rich clubs, so along the lines of, are there areas of brittleness where systems are vulnerable? If you interrupt hubs of activity, that might be a factor. So why don't you talk a little bit just about your work, your earlier work, sort of understanding, modeling, and sort of using this term rich club in terms of networks, they differ from other areas of the brain. So
Yeah. So my early work was in the domain of network neuroscience. And I was interested in how the particular network architecture that the brain has influences, again, at a very high level, in this case, let's say functional capacities of the brain. So what you have in the brain are areas that are very densely connected. So they make many, many, many connections, whereas most other areas only make more sparse connections. So these areas we would call rich in terms of connectivity. And on top of that, they form a club. So there's also a tendency for these very rich areas to also connect with each other more than you would expect by chance. So of course, because they are rich, there's a high chance that they connect to each other, but they connect to each other even more than you would expect by this chance level. So the question is, what is the role of these areas? Why would evolution have favored this? I have to also say that actually in many different networks, these kind of area or these kind of nodes come into existence. So we also have that in transportation networks. So this seems to be even a principle beyond the brain that is very common in nature. I was interested in what could these areas bring to the table in the brain, and how could they maybe do that. So some of my earlier work was just, if I create artificially networks that have these rich clubs or don't have these rich clubs, and if I look at kind of co-activation patterns that the other brain areas can form, where the co-activation patterns would be a stand-in for, okay, if I have different co-activation patterns, this might correspond to some tasks that people might do, right? If I do one thing, I need to recruit these brain areas together. And if I do another thing, I need to recruit those areas together. So the idea was these different co-activation patterns might be functionally relevant. And I was looking at how does the rich club affect this repertoire of how many different co-activation patterns can we have. And one of the earliest things I was doing was that I saw that the rich club actually increases the number of possible co-activation patterns that you have.
Okay.
And at least in the model that I was using, I could look into the mechanism how they did this. So that, of course, doesn't yet mean the brain does it like that, but at least in the model it was working like that.
Yeah.
By being there and forming a backbone that was very active all of the time, they could actually sustain the activity in the brain that would allow few other areas to activate also together. So if you wouldn't have them, the activity in the model would not be sufficient to sustain. So everything would die out.
Interesting.
So if you wouldn't have this, you would have many, many more areas to be active to actually sustain a level of activity. But the more you need to have active, the less room you have left to make interesting pairings.
That's very That's actually really interesting. I mean, I didn't know that. And that's actually it's like a principle right there that you need these hubs to sort of like maintain a certain stability to allow the networks to sort of do their thing over a certain amount of time. It's like if they're just simply a random distribution of nodes, just active, and then that pattern won't hold unless, right. Well, that's really
Yes.
cool. That's really cool.
So, but of course, these were models where it was only brain areas could be on or off. So that was the limit of what I could see. That okay, by them being active, forming a backbone, they allow many others to be either co-active or not co-active and form interesting patterns.
So it's kind of like a capacitor for the brain, something in some sense.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Raise the capacity for different patterns to emerge.
That's interesting. And then the rich club areas are, superior frontal gyrus, precuneus, superior parietal cortex, anterior cingulate cortex, insula, hippocampus, putamen. So those are sort of like the nodes that are in some sense, right?
Yes. Though I have to also say that this work was mostly done in the cortex with Gorka Zamora Lopez. We recently actually analyzed the really whole brain, so subcortex and cerebellum as well. And you see that actually the rich club completely shifts into the subcortical structures.
Huh.
The really, really rich connections are in the subcortex.
So what do you think is going on in terms, and this is a thing that I'm fascinated with, is in terms of the subcortical structures which seem so fundamental to gating and regulating activity in the cortex. And what do you think actually, is there like just multiple iterative loops that enhance enhance the stability, or what do you think actually is there like a description of like the mechanism by how, right? I mean, usually in papers you just say, oh, well, this area relays, is a relay station, or, but that's it. That's the end of the description. But in terms of mechanisms, what do you think is happening?
Yeah, that's actually still a very open and exciting question. So, of course, we're still bound by the resolution that we can have. We already have several subcortical structures and can already split those again into smaller ROIs, so regions of interest. And then we see that these regions of interest from subcortical structures connect to many, many, many parts of the brain. But we don't know yet that if you were to zoom in even further, whether these are actually all separate nuclei that are very targeted. But then there would not be rich clubs anymore. Then it would actually be just one nucleus doing one thing.
Yes.
So that's a resolution issue. We don't know yet if that maybe, if we get even more fine-grained, reduces the exciting finding of having the rich club in the subcortex.
Yeah.
But otherwise, it is very exciting to think of the possibility that it is actually such a rich club, so that it is actually converging there, because the subcortex has so few neurons.
Yes.
Compared to the rest of the brain, this is like 1% of the neurons.
Yes.
And then you have this extreme bottleneck where information is exchanged, that all of this projects onto few neurons and is then spread out again. And yeah, one idea I personally have is really this question: is this a computational bottleneck? Is this something like an extreme sparse latent space where information is compressed, the most important stuff is retained and then spread out through the entire network? But these are just very early, I would say, somewhat still crazy ideas that we have.
That's so interesting. I see exactly your point, where, this information-rich world, and then it comes in through these nodes and that are, sparse, and then they sort of speak to the cortex, and somehow the information is obviously filtered, hopefully, and lost, but the important information is not lost. It's like it sort of tunes the brain to the world in some sense, and yeah. That's interesting.
Yeah, no, that's currently what we're thinking. And of course, on top of that come all these other questions now, right? That evolutionarily speaking, that subcortex, cerebellum, and the cortex, of course, to some extent co-developed, but they have also, some of them are older in terms of evolutionary time. So there's also the question of if the subcortex did a lot of just coordinating our interaction with the world. And now this cortex comes on top of it. So how do these things actually go together? So it's actually a lot of this that the subcortex could do many important things and maybe is still now involved. And is the cortex on top of it modulating this, or how are they Yeah, how has this role of the cortex and the subcortex changed by having the cortex there now? So it's
Yeah.
maybe also not just a simple latent space that makes a sparse representation. It was something, and probably is still something that also immediately controls part of our movements and our decision making.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting because, the question immediately happens. Like I was just talking to somebody about hippocampal activity, and that's sort of an example of like, how does the hippocampus, let's say long-term memories are stored in the cortex somewhere, like, semantic space, or, how does the hippocampus know which areas of cortex to selectively activate, with a categorization of some information? It's like, how is that decision made by the hippocampus? It's like these fundamental mechanisms are still at the stage of like description, like, oh, it does it.
Exactly. How does it route? How does it make the decision? This goes here and this goes there.
Right. Yeah. But it must be, I think, and that's exactly sort of along the lines of what you're saying. We need more theory to sort of, help describe mechanisms like this as well. And I have a feeling we'll figure that out, but it might take some time. and actually, I wonder how we'll actually figure that out. Is it a combination of? So maybe that's an interesting question for this. Is that will it be like clever experimentation? Will it be sort of bottom up, trying different models? Is that the best way, or is that? And what modalities will you use? I mean, we have MEG, we have fMRI. We're not quite there looking at subcortical activity, so it's tough.
It is very tough. Yeah. But I think it's probably indeed a lot of iteration, and people from the one side, let's say from the computational side, having some ideas that how it might work, formulating that in a model, running it. At the same time, experimentalists, either based on their own ideas or because they see some models, how they work, trying to test exactly that. I think sometimes it can even just be very interesting to have experiments that might be theory guided, but to also have more experiments that might be just a little bit more out there, maybe not immediately targeting a specific theory, but just gathering the kind of data that you wouldn't have thought of inside a certain framework, because that might then again inform, without being unexpectedly informing suddenly this framework in completely different directions.
Yeah. That's interesting. And maybe this is where to bring up the question of AI, like, in terms of coming up with. So I think, AI isn't doing this yet, but we always wonder how people come up with unifying theories that actually have traction, that explain things. And it seems that there's a theory space that we can only explore so efficiently. And it seems like that would be an amazing role for AI, to sort of give it some phenomena and to try to have it explain it in the most efficacious way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Have it search this theory space efficiently. But yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a very exciting way to go. So far, I can really see that it can aggregate. So if I know part of the literature and I give that to the AI, maybe it can just go out and really find many other articles that have some similarity to that. So at least I can use it to aggregate what I have and see who else has maybe been thinking along similar lines.
Yes.
What I also like is you can also say, okay, I have this idea over here. I have this idea over there. What is the literature that connects these? So that if I start reading my articles, I never go too far away from the previous content or idea, but eventually I can go very far. But I have made a nice trajectory, so I maybe in my head can now connect things also better. I think that it can also help with these things. Yeah. I don't know how good it will be in coming up with its own ideas. I had tried one thing where I basically said, okay, I have this space of neuroscience. What if I try to look at the point in this space that is not populated yet? Nobody's doing that research.
Yes.
And I try to let the AI start from the closest it could start, where something actually existed, and move towards that point in a kind of hill climbing way. It came up with nonsense. That's in the end what it did. So
as first iterations always are. Yeah.
Yeah, it would do, I don't know, some functional MRI of a certain cognitive task in post-mortem brains. I was, it's not going to work.
We have to put a few more constraints on that.
Yeah. So it was not constrained enough. Maybe that region of neuroscience was empty for a reason.
That's interesting. That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, there's always, that's part of the problem of coming up with theories. You have to figure out which constraints are the important ones, once again, and go from there. I think, yeah, and actually along the lines of when you're talking about tracing papers, there's, just maybe one of many, but there's something called philo. It seems like they're doing this in other domains, and doing this in neuroscience could be powerful as well. It's sort of like like what you said. It's sort of like it creates this space of information and papers and connections, and that's so. It seems that it seems like the field, and I'm getting ahead of myself, but we'll get back to it. But the field is streaming for this type of thing and I always mention the first time I had this strong feeling that we need this is that, I don't know if you've gone to the Society for Neuroscience meeting.
Not this year, no.
Well, yeah, I haven't gone this. I didn't go this year either. But if you go, right, I mean, you go. It's like 30,000 people, and each individual just goes there. It's overwhelming immediately, and you just are doing your best just to focus on your thing. And then we all sort of get our information. Maybe we get one or two ideas, and then we go home and we do our research. And I was trying to think, okay, people say, oh, there's 30,000 people together, and they're all, but it's actually kind of not really true. It's like, there's all these tiny little groups that are all siloed, and they all kind of, and on an individual level, you get one or two ideas, and it's so inefficient. If there's some way of bringing all that, that knowledge, right there, it's there together in that building, but it's not there in terms of, we can't say this is the knowledge and everyone can look at it and sort of gather it all. And that's hard.
It's very hard. It's also, from my own experience, at least, very hard to understand. So we're all neuroscientists, but at the same time, I'm not sure I can always call myself a neuroscientist because there are other branches of neuroscience. If I go to the poster of these people, I don't understand.
Yes.
I really understand very little, if anything, of what they are presenting in that work. And that is because it is a completely different subfield of neuroscience.
Yes.
Which I'm, with my background, have never been trained. So even to break this barrier to even understand what some other people are working on is extremely difficult. But that's why I like this gradual, that I could find my path towards it. If I can just read something that is only always slightly out of my expertise and comfort zone, I can maybe gradually come towards the point that I understand it better.
Yes.
What people are saying.
Yeah. And to have a tool or something like that can help one move along this path. And even maybe, obviously there's, we'll talk about this later, like, how you can have culture changes where people, when they write a paper, they actually, part of the paper is to maybe make the effort to make the connections. Or perhaps, eventually AI will come along and take all 30,000 abstracts and put it into some way that we can all sort of understand it in some way. But that would be cool.
That would be very cool. Yeah.
Okay. So all right. So as far as Rich Club, that term has been around. I mean, that's sort of a network term that talks about rich connections with, of these hubs. And that it's the wonderful analogy of the capacitance sort of thing. So, okay, right. You also, just to bring up, you talk about how there's structural connectivity of actual white matter tracks or synaptic connections, but there's effective connectivity. Do you mind just talking a little bit about, in terms of just networks, what the difference between effective connectivity and the other types of connectivity?
Sure. Yeah. So, like you said, structural connectivity is really the physical cables, you could say, right? This is depending again on the scale that you're interested in. This can be the white matter tracks. This can really be the synaptic connections that you are talking about. So this is really the structural level. And then you have the functional level. This is typically co-activation patterns. It's a bit more associative, statistical in that sense. Do two brain areas tend to activate and deactivate in a similar fashion so that they correlate over time? Yeah. And then you have effective connectivity, where the idea is now that Whereas with functional connectivity, you only know about the statistical association. In effective connectivity, you have some idea about directionality and potentially also causality, that you would say area A really drives area B, which in turn drives area C. So in some sense, you might even say that if you really go down to a very detailed level in the structural connectivity, this is to some extent even effective, because I can really say that there's an axon going from here to here. So this neuron drives that neuron. That's in a way both structural and effective. At the more microscopic level, we often don't know, because we use diffusion weighted imaging. Areas are connected, but we don't know the directionality. And we try with this effective connectivity to estimate the directionality and to some extent whether we can talk about some causal relations, that one area drives the other.
Okay. And to do that, right, you need either high temporal resolution to look at maybe latencies or with fMRI, maybe some sort of modeling to understand, to try to sort of derive from the coactivation patterns at different paradigms, what's actually influencing what in that regard.
Yeah, you often have some models. You have maybe some hypotheses already about where connections might be. So this is more the dynamic causal modeling approach, also pioneered by Friston, where you might have different ideas of what could be potential interaction patterns. Then a friend of mine developed one that is more for the whole brain level, because dynamic causal modeling is often, at least originally, more for few areas and how they interact. The same for Granger causality is another approach. And a friend of mine, Mathieu Gilson, he has done this more for whole brain modeling, where you can simultaneously estimate effective connectivity for really hundreds of nodes.
Okay.
Where he makes it a bit easier in terms of the dynamics. He assumes it's just linear interactions, so it's just linear dynamics that makes it possible to estimate this. But then you have some idea of which areas drive each other. And it's important actually to have the whole brain thing there, because it might be that in terms of delay, one area precedes the other. So you might think there is an immediate drive from the one to the other. But if you take the whole network into account, you realize this actually goes through a couple of steps before the one drives the other.
Well, and that actually brings up a really good point. I mean, a lot of these models are based on, they have to make assumptions about certain, nodes and things like that. And sometimes it's a classic inverse problem. If you can have many solutions to this sort of network dynamic, but it's some progress, but it's always built on these assumptions. You want to make sure that the assumptions are sound and you can iterate from there. So then, going into whole brain modeling. But before we do that really quickly, you had a nice paper in 2017 on cortical rich clubs can organize state-dependent functional network formation by engaging in oscillatory behavior. And you talk a little bit about, in the paper, you delve into oscillatory behavior. So do you want to talk a little bit about the significance of the oscillatory behavior as far as that's concerned? Like what generates it and how does it organize things?
Yeah. So this was actually a direct follow-up of the paper where we looked at this capacity, but we knew, okay, the rich club allows for more different patterns to emerge, but how is it actually involved in the coordination of this and how could this work? So the one idea we had is that maybe by engaging as a rich club in oscillations, it could recruit other areas into the same oscillatory pattern. And here we're talking actually about very low frequency oscillations, below 1 hertz. It's very infra-slow oscillations. So it's not the typical bands that people usually look at.
Yes.
But we were thinking, can the rich club, by engaging in these oscillations, somehow recruit the right other areas into the network that is currently used?
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So we did not go, let's say, to the point that we could, let's say, model that if I tune these rich club areas to oscillations, what will be the network that starts to form, or that I could. But we went more with a combination of fMRI, where we would say, okay, if we have different task states, what would best explain these task states? And we usually saw that compared to rest, first of all, the rich club would oscillate. So in rest, the rich club was not oscillating. And then for each of these different task states, it was also a slightly different combination of rich clubs regions that would oscillate and also to different degrees. So It is still, I would say, a bit more of correlational evidence. It is not yet that we could say, okay, if I want to do task X, I need to put this and this up and this down, and then it will recruit this. But at
Yes.
least we had our first indication that it might be part of the mechanism.
So maybe the way I think of it sometimes is that there's these oscillatory attractor states in some sense, and it's sort of like all you need is like an oscillatory sort of input that sort of resonates, and then it activates this network that has this resonant oscillatory frequency in some sense. But maybe it brings up another point, and that is once again this disconnect between. I love, like, for instance, the work of Earl Miller. He's at MIT, and all he talks about is oscillations for everything. And we understand very heuristically, like, okay, alpha frequencies mean this, beta frequencies, gamma, and so on. And we understand that, but we don't really know mechanistically what they mean. And it seems that, you can have very low level modeling of like individual neurons, like in a network. And if you adjust the excitatory inhibitory balance and then the size, you can modulate the frequencies. And maybe that's the mechanism by which the frequencies exist, but it's all kind of disconnected though. It's all sort of still, it would be nice to actually have a unifying theory of oscillations up to, because I think it's like you say, it could be fundamental to how these rich club hubs control and speak to the rest of the brain.
Yeah, that's definitely one of these big open questions, because there are so many potential mechanisms how you can get oscillations. So you can even have oscillations without any influence of inhibitory neurons.
Okay.
Excitatory neurons, and just because of their refractoriness, that is basically the inhibitory component of it. And to that, you can get oscillations at the network level.
Yes.
And you can have it through coupling with inhibitory neurons. And you can have it through how the network is set up. So if the connectivity pattern is asymmetric, you can set it up in a way that oscillations emerge. So, and all of these might have then different implications of what you can do with these oscillations in terms of, communication of information or aligning of patterns. So again, one of the big,
all these open questions. I mean, it's really fascinating.
Yeah.
And that's actually an interesting point, because if an fMRI neuroscientist who does modeling wants to get into this, it's like a whole domain of understanding that is kind of intimidating, and not only intimidating, but more practically just takes a lot of time to delve into it. And is it worth it? Pascal Fries is another example that comes to mind. He's been pioneering oscillatory, and he has very specific theories about how information is passed, and with sort of carrier frequencies and things like that. And is that real? How do you test that? And I think you need more collaborative networks of people to get insight into this. But I like how I love how your paper sort of boldly put these things out there. And
you don't always have to believe your own theories. Sometimes you have to act like you believe them and put them out there.
Right.
I think you need to put on different hats. One day you do this, one day you do the other, because only by broadly exploring can you really come to a good understanding.
Well, it's healthy, I think, also to understand that, it's a common thing, and I mentioned it maybe relevant to your next papers, but that all models are wrong, and then only some are useful. And so, if you start out with the idea, okay, this is wrong, but how useful can it be to sort of push the field forward?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So let's go into your multiscale modeling before we go into the whole brain. I guess we can just go right into the whole brain models as well. So you had a paper in 2024 it was a really cool paper. I mean, I looked at it. I didn't have time to digest it completely, but I was pretty blown away by both that and your other one, modular integrative modeling, a new framework for building brain models. It was sort of a review, but it was also, I mean, it was pretty concise, but it was very overwhelming. Not really overwhelming in a bad way. It was really like it opened up a lot of things that were interested. Do you want to maybe talk about those two, maybe those two papers,
Sure.
maybe especially the spiking network model. Yeah.
Yeah, for this one, I first have to say I was just a very small cog in the big machine, because you saw how many people were involved there. And I think especially the first author, the PhD student at the time, Yahi Ponold, did an amazing job there. And Sascha van Alberda Jülich, she was the person who coordinated this as the senior author. So I would even say this is way more their achievement than it is mine, because I was really a small cog in this one.
Well,
But
either way.
But it is, I agree, it is a really, really cool paper, because it really tries to bridge many, many scales. Because it really goes from the spiking neurons. So you have, you could say this is already the microscale, but these are arranged in cortical columns, which have also the laminar arrangement and interlaminar connectivity profile. So you go to the mesoscale, and then all of this is connected at the whole brain level, that you have such column in each brain area, and then you have them also connected in a layer-specific way across the cortex. So it really tries to bridge all of these different aspects. And it is bridging this. This is the first phase of neuroscience that I mentioned in the beginning. This is the one where it's all about activity patterns, spiking statistics. So this model itself explains resting state fMRI, right? It explains spiking statistics, but it's not yet aimed to compute in any sense. So it doesn't get visual input or auditory input. So the entire brain, entire cortex is there, but it's all about these network interactions across scales without the information processing side at this stage. But it's already amazing what emerges from just bringing these things together.
Yeah, that is, I mean, that's actually, I mean, I think, all right. So yeah, I was both overwhelmed and I felt that it was the right direction, but you bring up a really good point. It was sort of like talking about all the areas interact to sort of emerge to form, fMRI patterns or resting state. And that's actually in itself extremely useful, but you're right. It sort of goes around the point of, okay, the goal of the brain is to, allow us to survive it. We need to process information. How do you tie in that goal to this? And the question I've had when I was trying to read this as much as possible, I had two thoughts. One, at the end of the day, someday when we understand the brain, will it be just like a car engine or something, like just a big collection of these heuristics that just sort of like work together in this way, and it's sort of like just stuff that works together and it solves a problem? Or will it be like, okay, this all points to these underlying principles that it's a little bit of both, but I guess our understanding is more, we'd like to understand how and why it evolved the way it did. I mean, and also the second thought is, with the European Brain Project, I mean, there was obviously that simulation of the cortical column, which was very dramatic and very, I mean, it's fascinating to look at, and you get a visceral sense of how complicated and involved things are. But it's not really theory driven. It's sort of like the idea that this sort of thing emerges and it's complex. And so there was some criticism of that. So how is this between that and what's the potential of this? How will you take this type of statement further?
Yeah. So with the concrete work of this particular paper, I think we can start to see already, even in the paper, the push towards function. It doesn't incorporate any particular function, but I think there are interesting questions being asked. So, for instance, they injected individual spikes. So they had a simulation. And the nice thing is with these simulations is you can repeat them exactly if you want. You can have the same randomization and repeat it exactly. So they did this, except that they injected one single spike, and you can trace the effect of that single spike. So you might even then, this raises questions about how is information also encoded in the brain. If you can trace the effect of one single spike being different, then you might actually wonder, okay, what about spike coding compared to rate coding? How important are individual spikes? Because we often abstract away and say, okay, we just have the activity at a more population level.
Yes.
So, and you could also say, well, maybe you can see that a different number or a different neuron will spike all the way at the end. And you could again ask, does that at a macroscopic level functionally make a difference? That would be the next step. But the fact that we can trace this difference and that this one spike triggers down a difference all along the way also has functional implications that we need to think about.
Yes. Yeah, and then you can maybe derive from that simulation, is it, rate coding? Is it population coding? I mean, you can sort of get what seems to be the information processing method that works in that regard. And once you have a model, and this is the important thing, and this is what everyone's going for, is that once you have some model, you can start putting in more parameters, and you can start doing tests on what works, what doesn't, what change, how things change, because it's so complex and it's so, it's right. I mean, and once again, the worry is that you could get the same solution with many different types of parameters. And
that's true, yeah.
And that's the art of modeling. You have to pick your parameters and then compare with experimentation. All the more reason to have something like this out there that people can collectively think about.
Absolutely. And even if you can have many different parameters solving the same problem, you can see then still whether there is some kind of clustering of these parameters. So could it be that they have at some level something in common, all these solutions? So they're different, but maybe at the same time, not so much. Maybe at a different level, they are actually doing very same things or very similar things. And maybe you can see entire families of solutions that where these are the same in some sense and these are the same in some sense. And maybe that is more interpretable than just having 100 different solutions. Maybe 50 of them belong together and the other 50 also belong together in a way.
Right. And it kind of brings up also another random thought of mine is that especially in the context of vision science, is that it's understood that the brain is obviously very hardwired. I mean, it's hardwired to be optimal to adapt to our environment and like what we live in and our society. So it's both hardwired and adaptable and malleable, and trying to also understand like how, the purpose for the hardwiring and how it optimally adapts as well. As there's different sort of themes like that go along. Yeah, no, this is completely fascinating. The review is sort of like an overview in some sense.
Yeah, it's a bit the idea again of how do we bridge the functional and this more biological side. And the idea we're proposing there is a bit of co-simulation in the end. That where you have models that are more on one side and models that are more on the other side, and can you not just simulate them together in a way and let them communicate with each other? So
that's interesting.
Yeah, so you could imagine you have this whole brain multi-scale model, and you just add maybe a relatively simple, more functional model that does maybe a convolutional neural network that mimics a little bit retina and LGN, what that extracts. But now you feed that into this big spiking neural model. So now you have actually extracted meaningful information from a visual scene and put that in there. And now you can ask, okay, how is this information now propagating through with spikes and where does it go and how does it come back? That was a bit the idea there. How can we start to bridge these things together? But maybe a first step is co-simulation.
Okay. That's actually really, that's an interesting idea. I like that. Yeah. Okay. And well, why don't we go to the paper that drew my attention to your work in general, which then opened up my whole world to your past papers. So that was great. It's called The Evolving Landscape of Neuroscience. You wrote this paper. It should be coming out in Aperture Neuro. So in this paper, rather than showing, applying your focus on understanding networks of the brain, you're understanding the field. And you did an analysis of citation networks and intellectual hubs. And maybe why don't you talk about it a little bit? I mean, you talked about, you sort of were able to identify, hubs and how well they're connected and how much they overlap in the growth trends and emerging areas in neuroscience and overreaching trends and open questions. So yes.
So yeah, this paper I was starting to get very excited and interested in the evolution of AI at the moment, or with all these large language models, and realizing that it's actually possible to use them programmatically, that you can actually go in Python and I can call GPT and send it some data. And I was, wow, this is cool. This is an opportunity. You can do something with this.
Yes.
And then I had this idea of what if I just take a big corpus of neuroscientific articles, and in the end, I had it from 1999 to 2023, and just tried to scrape everything I could get in this time period, and I had almost 500,000 articles and their abstracts. So what I did was I tried to embed these using large language models, and first try to understand what are actually the research themes or research domains in neuroscience. So I just clustered them based on their semantic similarity. So there has been prior work where we look at citation structure and cluster based on that. But then you might still have articles that form a cluster in this sense, but they might actually not be necessarily all semantically on the same research topic.
Yeah.
So that's why I found it cool that now you can do it with semantics. And the first thing was just to see, what is this landscape? What is the research we're doing in this last 25 years? And then you could really see then clusters emerging, that there is research on chronic pain and certain processes that are related to pain. You see entire cluster dedicated to the amyloid tau hypothesis in Alzheimer's. You see clusters focusing on synesthesia research, on consciousness, on resting state fMRI was its own kind of cluster, right? So you see all these things emerging. So my first idea was, what are these things? And once I had them, I could, of course, also now ask, okay, now we have kind of, in terms of content, semantically, we have now these little groups that work on one particular research topic. Now I can ask, okay, how do I now have connections between them? So do people that work on resting states look at research that comes out on Alzheimer's? And then I started to look at the citation structure across these different clusters. And there I actually was very positively surprised that there are actually not so many silos. So they are semantically defined and very nice circumscribed research topics. But it seems like there is a lot of cross-citation, so that these clusters really look at what the other clusters are doing. And what you can see is that some clusters, of course, are more central than others. They are also rich clubs in that sense, or at least hubs. And you see there two types. I had the impression the one was very foundational knowledge that others need. So there was one on very basic mechanisms of memory, long-term potentiation, long-term depression. Many other clusters in that completely unrelated research are still pointing to that, because they still need this information to build their theories and make their experiments. And the others are a bit maybe more on the methodological side. So I also saw that a lot of this resting state functional connectivity cluster was used, because I do think that more and more people are looking at functional connectivity as a new way to look also at other cognitive processes, perceptual processes. I saw this was a hub as well, and I think this is more because they spread out the method to other clusters.
Yeah.
And there were very few that you would say, oh, this is really entirely siloed off or on the fringe. So that was very interesting to see how well integrated, at least in this citation structure, the field actually is, even though it is so diverse in terms of the research that is going on.
Yeah. So that's actually hopeful. And it kind of goes against the, on one hand, you think, oh, people should talk more. But on the other hand, you think, okay, the scientists leading these projects are kind of aware of this stuff, and they refer to these papers, and they try to, obviously when you ever write a paper, you want to build on, you want to put it into a context. And so you typically refer to the papers, outside of your immediate domain to sort of say, this is how this paper is important. And so that's good. That's good. Yeah.
Yeah, that was very, very positive to see. Then the next thing I was interested in is, now I had these individual research lines, or, well, not yet so granular, but these research themes. And the question now I was wondering is there are there some principles that explain what our research is like? In that case, I actually came up with some dimensions that I myself could think of and would find interesting. So I was wondering, okay, what species are we studying? Are we having a more computational approach? Do we have a more empirical approach? Is it hypothesis driven? Is it data driven? So what are all the ways that we do our research? What spatial and temporal scales do we focus on?
Yep. Yeah.
What is the role of theory, and what kind of theory are we looking at? So I analyzed this as well by looking at the individual clusters and basically, again, with the help of LLMs, extracting a couple of sample articles, and was just seeing, okay, if we look at these sample articles, what species are we talking about here, the researchers? That was very informative, and I will not go into all of the different things that I looked at, but a couple of things that I found very interesting here is, first of all, the scales. So both the spatial and the temporal scales, my impression was that it's very well represented. From the smallest to the biggest, we do research at all scales. And from the fastest to the slowest, we do research at all scales.
Yep.
But it's true that here the integration is not yet there. So you see in the temporal scale is actually better than in the spatial scale. So you see actually more integration, in particular neighbors. So the second and the minute and the hour and the day, they tend to go together. So there seems to be research in the same clusters that look at these two scales always together.
Okay.
In the spatial scale, it was a bit more fragmented, that people look at their scale and not too much beyond. Of course, that doesn't mean that doesn't happen. It's just not so common.
It seems that the tools limit more the spatial, the scale in terms of how far you can go versus temporal scale. It's a little bit easier to sort of, just look a little bit longer or whatever.
And the other thing that I saw was, or that I found particularly interesting, was when I looked at the theory. And what for myself defined in this theory dimension is more, okay, I can on the one hand, of course, I can also first start with theory or no theory, right? Is theory playing a role at all or not? But the moment that theory plays a role, I can ask at which granularity is again this theory. And I'm not talking about scale here so much. It is more of how all-encompassing this theory wants to be. So
Okay.
you can have on the one hand, and I gave it the name micro-theories, that you would have one particular phenomenon and you would specify a mechanism that explains this particular phenomenon.
Yes.
So very concrete to this, and maybe not necessarily generalizable to anything else. And on the other hand, you have the grand theories, where you might think of predictive coding, the Bayesian brain, the critical brain hypothesis, these things that want to explain phenomena, many phenomena that would fall all under the same umbrella in some sense. But
Yes.
they might explain in vision, they might explain in auditory processing, they want to be more global. And what I saw is really an overabundance of these micro theories, that you see a lot of people using a very specific mechanistic account of one phenomenon and not so much of the grand theories.
Yeah.
And actually talking also to other people, it might even be that what you have in terms of grand theories, the question is this even more than there is? Because I think to some extent we might also pay sometimes lip service in our abstracts to a grand theory.
Yes.
And say, oh yeah, this fits with this, but it wasn't actually driven by it.
Yes. Yes.
So that was for me the slightly worrying thing, that I thought, oh wow, we have a lot of nitty-gritty explanations for things, but we're not bringing them together.
Yeah. And I think that's sort of maybe the culture of research. You have an observation and you want to sort of stay within what you understand to try to explain it, and that works very well. But at the same time, right, you're sort of if you go a little bit too far outside of what you're doing, your measurement, it seems that it's very easy to have general theories that are sort of not even correct or incorrect. They're just sort of statements, but or you could criticize. I mean, a lot of people worry about their reputation, and they stay very close to their work. They don't speculate too much until they got tenure, or even after they retired or whatever. So that's actually a really important thing. I mean, I think that right. You showed these trends of maybe the basic methodology decreasing a little bit, fundamental research being decreased, but also the lack of theory.
Yeah.
So how do you think one could change this? I mean, is it something changeable? Is it?
I think we can do something about it. I have been more and more interested in general in philosophy of science, and also what what is a theory in the first place.
Yeah.
And even there, you see that even the philosophers are not quite there yet on what is the definition of a theory. But one of the two big ones would actually identify a theory just with the collection of models inside its theory. So it is actually not one big theory from which models are derived. You have maybe one grand phenomenon that everybody's interested in, and everybody builds their own model of it. Just the collection of all these models, that's your theory. So I think the way we can go about this is actually first see whether all these different phenomena for which we have individual mechanistic models, is there not already common ground? Are they not already belonging actually together? Is there not already kind of a group of phenomena that we can say, actually, we can call this the domain for which we would need a theory? So instead of having all these phenomena on their own, we put them together and say, these phenomena together form a group.
Yes.
And for these phenomena, we do have then individual theories, at least models, where we could say, okay, if we cut this and say this is a group of phenomena that together forms a domain, then all the individual models form the theory of that domain.
Okay.
And then you can start to still think, how do individual models maybe come together? So maybe even that one research group made a model of a phenomenon and the other did the same, studied the same phenomenon. You can still ask, how compatible are these models? Can we start to merge them together? But I think to start to build this kind of theoretical framework, maybe the first step is to just identify which phenomena belong together and constitute a domain or a sub-discipline. And what are the individual models there, and can they then together form the theoretical body that attached to this, let's say, meta phenomenon
Yeah. So right. So it's sort of like this sort of nested theoretical network. And I can't even, off the top of my head, I can't think of, right. There's a lot of sort of mechanistic sort of things. Like, for instance, I think of some really good mechanistic explanations, like how do you localize sound?
Yeah.
And there's it's sort of a mechanistic explanation. I'm not sure if it's a theory, because I mean, that's sort of a description of how this particular problem is solved. I mean, at some level. And then what would be a theory that would unify maybe different ways of sound processing? You'd then take the different types and then sort of unify these mechanistic explanations to sort of why they're incorporated as opposed to other solutions. I mean, then maybe that's what the theory does. It sort of says why this one was chosen by evolution as opposed to another. Maybe is that what you're sort of getting at, or
yeah, I think it's also a little bit that that sometimes you might need even models or mechanisms that are hard to unify, but they explain different aspects of the same phenomenon. So you kind of need both, and both need to be part of your theory, even though you cannot unify them directly.
Okay.
It's strange, and that's something that sometimes I think we have to live with in a way. I mean, of course, at the same time, we should make the effort to not just accept this and say, well, that's just how the world is, and we never try. But I think we also, along the way, have to be also comfortable that sometimes, at least for a long time, we just have to accept that this is. So looking at physics, with relativity and quantum, and one explains the large scale and one the very small scale, and they just don't vibe with each other. And yet we need them both. And I think maybe for us, this will happen as well. That sometimes we just need to see what is the domain, what are all the phenomena that belong together and we want to explain. And sometimes we might end up with many models, and not all of them will be either reducible to each other or compatible with each other. Yet they need to all form our theoretical understanding of this.
Okay. I think I understand what you're saying. I mean, so one thing that one explanation of a theory is it helps to predict or motivates future experiments, or it's sort of something that unifies different aspects that in some sort of explanation that in which they may not be compatible, right? And so I guess the idea would be then building an ever wider context by which the brain is assembled over time in evolution and solves this problem of survival. And yeah, I mean, I can't help but think that that's like, with people, like, for instance, we're just one projection in this possibility space of that was sort of kludged together bit by bit over millions of years. And that in itself is sort of one could say, oh, that's a construct that you could form theories from in some sense. But I understand what you're saying, trying to understand how these kludges work, what drives them, the principles behind them, and how they hang together to solve specific problems. Thinking at that sort of one step up, this meta sort of level, I think is helpful to for many ways. I mean, right. I mean, informing AI or understanding how social dynamics work and better, and understanding disease. And yeah, no, I understand what you're saying. And just simply focusing on the one mechanism, we're still very early days. I mean, like, for instance, even trying to look at, like, that just reminds me of, I think of random things, like thinking of understanding dyslexia. I mean, there's whole theories on dyslexia, from brain networks all the way down to individual cells being sensitive to rapid changes versus slow changes. And some people think, oh, that's the explanation. But some people think, no, that's only part of it, or it might be irrelevant. And so having something that can bring these together to sort of better test them. Yeah. So how would we do that? So is it a cultural shift? Is it like, do you just simply talk to your peers and sort of constantly, or write more papers like you have to bring out this point? I think that the only way of doing it is if somehow I, as the researcher, I can be helped by going somewhere like a website or some sort of tool that would help me it's like a lever in my thinking about this. I mean, that's the way I would change my behavior. Yeah. What do you think of that sort of thing?
Yeah, no, I think that would be absolutely amazing and also necessary. That there is something that helps us to integrate things. Right? So that can see the difference. Again, it sees the things and can see that some of them are related in some sense, and just bring them together and cluster them together.
Yes.
Because once I see that actually my model that explained this, but this up here actually belongs into a bigger framework, then I can start to ask, what other phenomena in the same class does my model explain, right? So I can already share much more and see also, oh, there are these models that I have never considered, but that belong to this. So I can also now take this. So there's something that helps me also see better what is out there in terms of data, in terms of models, in terms of the theories that are there.
Yes. Yeah. So I envision this as something like, like, for instance, the Allen Brain Institute has this big brain, also at Montreal Neurologic Institute, there's a lot of these projects that assemble the anatomy, always the cellular anatomy from cells all the way on up. You can imagine some sort of place, a clearinghouse of theories of how things cluster, of how explanations cluster in some sense. And it could be based on papers, but it could also be a little bit more abstracted. I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud now.
No, that would be absolutely amazing. I would also find it cool if you would have, let's say, either the regions of interest that are very common in terms of that they are names that are commonly used. And imagine you could just go through them, and for each of them, it would just list you maybe all the theories that have ever been attached or talked about that particular part of the brain. Right? So mapping not activity onto the different ROIs, but mapping theories on the ROIs. Like, all these areas are associated with that theory, or all of those are associated with that theory, or these is where the overlap is. There are 3 theories talking about what these areas are doing. I think that would also already be very helpful, that if you come from the other side, if you come from the side that you study a particular brain area or process, that you can say, okay, I'm interested in gamma oscillations. And then it just says, okay, well, there's this theory talking about it, this one, and this one, and this one. Maybe check they are all relevant to what you're interested in.
Yes.
And I think we need to have this from several sides, so that I can go to a theory and it tells me, well, this is the data that people have gathered to test this theory. These are the models that have been associated with that theory. Maybe here are the brain regions that have been associated with that theory. But also the other way around. I start from the brain region, and it tells me again, where are these other things? Where's the theory? Where's the model? Where are other relevant phenomena that if you look at this, you should also look at? So that we build these graphs that help us to navigate this. We start from our silo, we just start to see where the other things are.
That is so right. That's so cool. Right. I think that would be so useful to so many people. And it actually could build a community where you're constantly engaging with this, and not only to learn, but to inform people. And, and one can even imagine, I often think of like the future of publishing. It almost seems sort of quaint and old fashioned already that we do our research, we write up a paper, and there's the paper.
Mm.
It seems that the unit of understanding that we produce, it seems like if we tried to plug it directly into something like this, it would be much more efficient, as opposed to writing the paper and then having some, AI sort of scrape the literature and then find this. Why not just simply engage in this
immediately
thing?
put it in. Yeah.
And that would be the body of knowledge that we actually see growing, as opposed to having little bits of it that exist in our heads.
Yeah, that would be absolutely amazing. This database needs to come into existence.
Yes. Well, I'm happy to try to help, and I think
me too. If there's a community of people who would like to do it, I'm happy to be engaged. This would be amazing to have this.
It's a very worthy goal, I think. And so I'm trying to drum up more interest as well. So maybe we can work together to go from here.
Yeah. No, that would be the dream.
Yeah. All right. Well, one last question. Okay. So I'm just going to final questions. We talked a little bit about future directions potentially and what to do. I always like to end with, do you have any advice for young scientists who are, from any domain, or young neuroscientists, computational neuroscientists? Like, what would you recommend that they do?
That's a very good question. Of course, the answer is probably biased, because maybe it's something that I personally liked, and I think for me it was helpful. But the first thing is that even within neuroscience, you might be in a bubble. So understand that neuroscience is very big, and maybe try to look also around. But beyond that, I would also say, have a look beyond neuroscience. So I think it is always very helpful to also see what other disciplines are up to and how they can help you understand things in the brain. So to go back, you mentioned Pascal Fries. So he once gave a talk, and after seeing that, and I had before not engaged with oscillations yet, I was interested in what he was doing. But I also started to look up, okay, so how does radio work? How does frequency modulation work? How does amplitude modulation work? How is communication working in radios?
Yes.
Because that's where I know that oscillations do these things.
Yes.
And then you can come back, and maybe it gives you fresh ideas on how to understand the brain.
That's great advice. I really like that, because there's so much you can learn from just going outside your domain, learning this sort of area and bringing it in. I think a lot of the field is driven by people who have got their PhDs in theoretical physics, and then they become neuroscientists, and they bring all this sort of conceptual tools on the field. I think the field only grows that way.
Exactly. So, I mean, you need to balance it. Of course, you need to do your work and be an expert in what you're doing. But once in a while, if you have the time, just look what the others are doing.
That's perfect way to end this podcast. And I look forward to talking to you more. I'm hoping to see you at OHBM. We're hoping to plan a podcast, a live podcast, hopefully, that includes you and a few other people talking about this a little bit more.
Absolutely. I'm very excited about that already. And it was a pleasure to be here today. It was really a lot of fun to talk.
It was a pleasure as well. I enjoyed it. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Neurosalience is brought to you by Organization for Human Brain Mapping. This week's episode is produced by Xiqian Michel Li and Ömer Faruk Gülban.